Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. For those of you that like to get to the juicy story where you have the straightforward Bigfoot encounter, well, I've got that for you on this channel right now. But the full stories are really worth listening to, and I've got them listed at the bottom, because really, just the Bigfoot encounter without the whole experience from the beginning to the middle and the end is really worth listening to. But if you just want to get to the juicy encounter that people have sent in to me, by all means, here are a few examples of them right now on my channel. So get straight into the business, shall we? And let's get started. I still remember that day with such a crystal clear clarity, as if it was almost yesterday, because it is seared in my memory like a tattoo on a sailor's arm. There are so few memories I have of my early life as a young 7-year-old girl, but this is a moment in time that I have never, ever forgotten. I remember absolutely everything about this day with such a crystal clear clarity, from the reflections of the trees in the water to the sight of the dragonflies buzzing across the lake. I also vividly recall the sweet, intoxicating smell of pine needles that infused the air with the scent of Christmas, to the warm sunny shafts of sunlight that warmed my back with their brilliant sunny rays. I even recall those hazardous moments as my wobbling white tiny feet sprawled out over the tree limb that lay across the water. I could feel the rough texture of the brown bark beneath my soft feet as I pulled my weight forwards to stretch out my other leg. The log was wobbling underneath my slight weight, but I was not at all concerned about this, and I eagerly pressed forward with extreme confidence and exuberant enthusiasm as I giggled happily, while Nina clapped jubilantly. I could hear her chuckling with delight as she watched me balancing across the timber beam. But then as I put my foot down on the mossy edge of the bark that was so slippery that I suddenly began to lose my balance, I skidded and went flying and then crashing and finally sinking and plunging into the murky depths of this icy cold lake. I remember my pretty blue dress got caught up in something under the water, and I don't actually know what it was, but I was frantically trying to pull my dress away from it. And whatever it was, this structure was holding it down so hard that, try as I might, my dress would just not shift, and neither could I. I was fighting tirelessly to escape this watery grave, and I fought with all my might and with every strength that I had left in me, while oscillating my arms and legs under the water like a frantic octopus. It didn't help at all that I could not swim either, which made my hopeless situation all the more deadly. I was desperately distraught and wildly trying to get air into my lungs, struggling to breathe and swallowing copious amounts of water. After a while, I just guess I surrendered to my fate, and I was filled with these incredible waves of peace, tranquility and joy. For a moment it did feel as if I was floating in and out of my body, as bizarre and as strange and peculiar as that may sound. Suddenly the feeling became almost euphoric. I gather Nina had watched me for a moment, and then in absolute horror, realizing what had actually happened, she ran back to the house to call my mother. Quite suddenly I could feel myself being pulled away and dragged from the watery grave in which I lay, with the full force and strength of something very huge. I found myself being carried in these massive, colossal, Herculean-sized arms, and I can only imagine that I must have looked exactly like a bedraggled, very wet rag doll. I could feel something running with me in their arms, and it felt like I was running with the wind, and when they breathed they sounded exactly like a horse. I could smell the strong scent of pine needles, and I knew I was in the outer edge of the woods close to the lake. I felt a firm pressure of very strong fingers prizing out the water from my lungs, and imagine my surprise when I found myself staring up into the kindest, most concerned treacle-brown eyes that I've ever had the pleasure to see. I was coughing up copious amounts of water, and I could hear the soft chattering sound that appeared to be encouraging me to keep coughing. Then I saw her, and she wasn't human, but she was not an animal either, more like an amalgamation of actually both. She was like a human with various ape-like characteristics to her physique, like the typical overlong arms of the ape-like species. I remember she possessed these soft curling waves of hazel red-brown hair that covered her body, and even her small firm female breasts. I do remember thinking she was like a towering giant because she was absolutely humongous in size and in girth,
and she had muscle and definition, which most athletes would just spend a lifetime to acquire. I cannot tell you her exact measurements, but at a guess I would say she was about 8 feet tall, 700 pounds, and 4 foot wide. I remember she had a very large cone-shaped head and huge shoulders without much of a neck, and I remember she had a long angular face, prominent brow ridge, and relatively slender mouth. Her leathery, shiny skin was like the colour of a hazelnut, but it was her deep-set, twinkling treacle-brown eyes that I will never, ever forget as long as I live. I remember them with such crystal-clear clarity all these years later. They were, to date, the kindest, most beautiful eyes I have ever had the pleasure to witness, that quite literally exuded an unconditional, non-judgmental love, second only to the love of God. That is how powerful, poignant, and beautiful her angelic energy appeared to me, without exaggeration. I remember this humanoid, hairy creature turned me around on my back and slapped me with her jumbo-sized hands as finally I spewed out some more water along with the contents of my stomach. The creature then pulled back my hair and placed her hands on my forehead and cheeks as if ensuring that I was indeed all right, and then she darted away for a moment and came back with a huge pile of wild blackberries for me in her enormous hands, which she presented me and indicated to me to eat by mimicking the action of eating so that I would understand what she was trying to tell me. The creature watched me very zealously as I proceeded to eat those blackberries, and the juices poured down my face, staining the edges of my mouth in a bright blue-purple colour. Even she knew that sugar is always needed after a shock. I began to enjoy the blackberries very much, and ate them hungrily, all the while observing and admiring this unusual creature. I also studied her with fascination and giggled a few times because she was so perturbed about me that her serious expression on her face made me laugh so much. She then picked me up in her arms and carried me to the sound of human voices, literally only yards away. She pushed me forwards and pointed to my mother, and then she stood there watching me from the tree line. I think she was making sure that my mother found me, but she didn't want to be seen herself, because she liked to remain invisible and in the shadows. I could hear the voice of my mother screaming, and her dress and hair were absolutely soaked to the skin, and the leather boots that she was wearing were completely ruined. She kept diving under the water, searching for me. She was sobbing, screaming, and plummeting under the water, at the same time as feeling around for me with her arms like a blind person, stumbling around the darkness in a frenzy. She kept crying, "Oh, my baby, my precious baby!" I remember walking over to the water and standing by my sister on the grassy bank, observing my mother's desperate attempts to find me. We both watched my mother diving under the water frantically, searching and screaming for me. My sister and I started to giggle and chuckle together, because seeing my mother so frantic was so funny for us at the time, especially as I was now perfectly fine. You can imagine my mother's surprise when she glanced up and saw me chuckling with my sister with a mouth stained with blackberry juice. My mother became irate. "That is not funny," she said, grabbing me in her arms and holding me for dear life, as if she never ever wanted to let go of me ever again. She was angry and yet overjoyed at the very same time, and her blue eyes were flooded over with tears. She looked at me and scolded me fiercely. "You think this is funny?" she scolded. "You think this is funny? All the while I think you're dead, you're stuffing your face with blackberries. How can you play such a horrible game on me? I thought you were dead. Do you realise how terrifying that was? You're both turning out to be monsters and mischievous, just like your father." All these years later, my mother truly believes that my sister and I pranked her that day by pretending to drown. When I tried to tell her about the hairy ape-like humanoid that had rescued me and saved my life, she told me to stop making up terrible tales and that she'd quite had enough of all our wind-ups. At the time, she blamed my father for our behaviour, because he was always making up all kinds of jokes, and she was convinced that his bad sense of humour was rubbing off on us in an insidious way.
So there we are. That's the juicy bits of our stories tonight. I personally think you should go back and listen to the whole story because it makes it so much more exciting, because then you learn all about where it happened, the location, and all about the fabulous characters involved in the story, and that makes the story so much more gripping. But as I say, so go down to the description and then click on to the YouTube link, and then you will hear the whole story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.